The sirens cried in the distance as the evening lights of New York painted the sky in fading pink and gold. Dr. Eve Carter stepped out of the taxi in front of St. Helens General Hospital. The tall glass building rose like a pillar of hope and fear at once. Her white coat felt heavier than usual. It was her first evening shift as a trauma surgeon, and though her face showed calm, her heart beat like a small drum trapped in her chest. Inside the hospital, the noise never stopped. Nurses hurried with clipboards. Doctors called out for reports. Patients waited with tired eyes. Eve held her ID card close to her chest as she walked through the busy corridor. She had trained for years to reach this place. But here among the fast words and faster footsteps, she felt like an outsider in a world that moved without mercy. "Dr. Carter, right?" A tall nurse named Claire greeted her with a polite smile. "You're the new trauma surgeon." "Yes," Eve said. "First night, I'll try not to get in the way." Claire laughed softly. "Good luck trying." This place never slows down. Eve followed Claire into the emergency wing. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. Machines beeped in mixed rhythm, voices pressed together, all urgent, all essential. She took a deep breath and reminded herself of the promise she made years ago: to heal, to serve, to never let pride drown compassion. That promise had carried her through endless study nights and lonely mornings. But not everyone looked at her with welcome. Some older doctors eyed her with cold curiosity. A senior surgeon whispered something to his assistant, and they both smirked. Eve caught the words "beauty doctor" and "soft hands." She straightened her posture and focused on the next chart, pretending not to hear, even while the words stung like a thin blade behind her ribs. Across the trauma bay, a paramedic rolled in a stretcher. He moved with quiet control, his voice firm but low as he spoke to a nurse. His hair was a little untidy, his uniform wrinkled, his face marked with the trace of long days and little sleep. "We've got a male, mid-30s, head trauma, pulse weak," the paramedic said. The nurse nodded and directed him to bed 5. Eve noticed the care in his movements. Even as he lifted the patient, he was gentle, never rough. She stepped closer. "Dr. Carter, what happened on scene?" The paramedic met her eyes for the first time. His gaze was steady, calm. "Construction fall, 20 feet. He was unconscious by the time we got there. Vitals, BP dropping, but responsive to fluids," he replied. His voice carried experience, not pride. Eve nodded. "Good work. I'll take it from here." He gave a short nod and backed away as she started the exam. A senior doctor entered, glancing at the monitor. "Who brought him in?" he asked. "Paramedic Bennett," a nurse answered. The senior smirked. "Bennett again. Always trying to play hero." Eve frowned, but kept silent. The operation went fast and rough. Afterward, when the patient was stable, she went to wash her hands. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired. She pressed her lips together, thinking of how respect in this place came slower than trust. Later that night, while reviewing charts near the supply room, she heard 2 doctors talking nearby. "That Bennett thinks he's a surgeon," one said. "Just a paramedic, yet he barks orders like he owns the place." Another voice chuckled. "And that new trauma doctor? She's too quiet to last here. Let's see how long she lasts once the real nights start." Eve's hands tightened around her folder. She had faced doubt before, but something in their tone brought back every memory of people saying she was only chosen for how she looked, not what she could do. She lifted her chin and walked away. At 2 in the morning, the ER calmed for a short while. Bennett sat by the ambulance entrance, writing his report. Eve stepped outside for fresh air. The night was cold, the sky deep gray. The streetlights shimmered across puddles left by the earlier rain. She paused near him, hesitating before speaking. "Long night," she said. He looked up. "Every night is long." She nodded. "You did good work tonight." His eyes softened a little. "You too, doctor." There was no smile, only honest words between 2 people who had seen too much in a single shift. When she turned to go back inside, she felt something curious. Beneath the tension of this new place, a quiet spark of respect began to form. Not from titles or uniforms, but from shared exhaustion and the silent knowledge that they both came here to keep people alive. She walked back through the bright hallway, the hum of machines echoing behind her, ready for whatever would come next. The next morning came with a gray sky and the heavy smell of coffee in the hospital halls. Eve had barely slept. She had stayed up late reviewing patient notes, trying to learn every detail of the new system. Even after years of study, she felt she had to earn her place all over again. Her feet ached, her head throbbed, but she refused to let anyone see it. Luke Bennett arrived at the ambulance bay before sunrise. He was already reading the call report from the night shift. His partner handed him a cup of cold coffee. Luke smiled in thanks, though the drink did nothing to wake him. For him, every day started the same way, with a silent hope that nothing too tragic would come through the radio, and that he would get home early enough to have breakfast with his daughter Sophie. Home was quiet when she was asleep, and soft laughter filled it when she was awake. That thought carried him through the noise and chaos. By noon, the hospital had reached its usual storm. Phones rang, voices overlapped, doors opened and closed nonstop. Eve was in the trauma bay when the call came in of a high-speed car accident. 2 ambulances were on the way. She rushed to prepare the room, giving orders with calm authority. Nurses moved fast, grabbing supplies. She tied her hair tighter, her heartbeat steady, but her mind alert. Minutes later, the ambulance doors flew open, and Luke was the first one in. His face was tense, his uniform marked with dust and sweat. Male driver, late 40s, ribs broken, head injury, he said quickly to Eve. We stabilized the airway, but he's losing blood fast. Eve nodded. On my count, move him to table 3. Her voice carried strength, not doubt. They worked together in silence, like 2 sides of one machine. Luke passed instruments, holding pressure when she asked, never hesitating, never second-guessing her. When the man was finally stabilized, Luke exhaled with relief. His hands were shaking slightly, and Eve noticed. Good job out there, she said quietly. He gave her a brief nod. Just doing my part. Another doctor, Dr. Matthews, walked by watching the 2 of them. You're being kind again, Dr. Carter, he said with a small smirk. That's a paramedic's job. They get paid to do the heavy lifting so we can do the real work. Eve looked at him straight. Without the heavy lifting, there'd be no patient for you to work on, she replied. Dr. Matthews laughed. Careful, doctor. You might start a friendship with the help. Luke's jaw tightened, said nothing, and went to clean his hands. Eve wanted to speak, to make the moment lighter, but he was already walking out. The words hung in the room, sharp and heavy. By the time she finished her reports, he was gone back to the streets. Later that evening, Eve sat in the doctor's lounge, staring at the city lights through the glass wall. She thought about how easily people divided the world into ranks. She never liked that kind of thinking. Her father had been a small-town doctor who treated everyone as equal. That belief was why she chose this career. But now she was surrounded by people who measured worth in titles, salaries, and long resumes. Sometimes she wondered if kindness had gone out of style. Luke sat in his ambulance on the curb outside the hospital, tapping his finger on the steering wheel. He could still hear Dr. Matthews' mocking voice. He had been called worse before, by impatient surgeons who forgot that every life started in his hands first. But this time, it hit deeper, maybe because it happened in front of Eve. She seemed different, not like the others. Yet she had stood silent while he was mocked. He knew she defended him later, but still, the sting remained. That night another call came. Eve was in the ER, when Luke rushed back in with a small boy who had collapsed from an asthma attack. The child's mother cried beside the gurney. Luke's voice was firm and calm as he gave updates to the nurse. Eve took control quickly. Nebulizer ready, she said. Oxygen, now. They worked together again, word by word, movement by movement. Within minutes, the boy began breathing. His chest rose easier, his color returned. The mother grabbed Eve's hand and whispered, "Thank you." Eve looked at Luke and said, "He's the one who saved your son's life. He got him here in time." The mother turned to Luke and hugged him in tears. He froze for a moment, then gently patted her shoulder. "He'll be fine now," he said softly. When they stepped outside, Eve stopped him next to the vending machines. "You shouldn't let what people say get to you," she said. Luke shrugged. I just do my job." "I know how that feels," she said. "People think my face means I can't hold my own in surgery." He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, we both got people who judge too quick. They stood quietly for a while, the hum of machines behind them, city lights glowing through the windows. For the first time, their conversation wasn't cold or careful. It was honest. She saw the tired strength in his eyes, and he saw the steady warmth in hers. It wasn't friendship yet, not even trust, but a start made in silence and respect as the night wrapped around them and the hospital kept breathing without pause. The week passed with long nights and endless calls. Eve moved from room to room, treating broken bones and bleeding wounds, her hands steady, even when her heart raced. Luke came and went through the ambulance bay, always carrying someone who needed saving. They spoke little during the busy hours, but noticed each other often, like two currents meeting in the same stream. One evening, the rain came down hard against the hospital windows. The sound filled the hallways and mixed with the steady hum of machines. Eve stayed late to check on a patient while most of the doctors left for dinner. When she walked toward the ambulance exit, the main lights flickered under the storm. She saw Luke near the parked ambulance finishing a report on his clipboard. His hair was damp, his jacket wet from the rain outside. "Still here?" she said as she walked toward him. He smiled faintly. "Paperwork never ends. You catching up on notes? No rest for anyone tonight?" Luke chuckled softly. His tired eyes softened. He looked at her like someone who understood what tired really meant. For a moment, the noise of the hospital faded. They both just stood watching the rain slide down the glass door. When another paramedic called Luke from the radio, he turned to go, but a small photo slipped from his pocket and landed near Eve's feet. She picked it up carefully. It was a photo of Luke holding a little girl with bright eyes and brown curls. They both looked happy. "This is your daughter?" she asked. Luke turned back and nodded. "Yeah, her name's Sophie. She's 6. She's beautiful," Eve said. "She has your smile." He gave a small laugh. "She has her mother's world inside her. I just try not to ruin it." Something in his tone made Eve pause. She handed the photo back gently. "You're raising her alone?" "Yeah," he said after a short breath. "My wife passed away 3 years ago. A car hit her when she was crossing the street after her shift. Sophie was just starting preschool." He looked down at the floor. "Since then, I just work, sleep, and take care of her. She's the reason I keep going." Eve felt a tightness in her chest. That must have been hard. He shrugged, but his voice stayed low. "It's easier to handle pain when you have someone to live for. I see people die every week. It teaches you to stop pretending you have time to waste." Eve nodded slowly. She wanted to say something comforting, but words felt small beside grief. "You're stronger than you think," she said at last. "And Sophie is lucky to have you." He smiled again, this time warmly. "You sound like someone who's been through her own share of lessons." She looked away toward the door. "My work became my life years ago. It's easier to fix a wound than to fix loneliness. My parents wanted me to start a family, but I chose this instead. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." Luke's expression softened. Saving lives is never the wrong choice. The alarm on his radio sounded just then. He quickly gathered his bag. Another call. They said highway collision, 2 passengers. "I'll see you in an hour, maybe less." When he left, Eve stood watching as the ambulance lights disappeared through the rain. She didn't know why her chest felt heavy or why she hoped he'd returned safe. An hour later, the ambulance came back with sirens off. The 2 passengers were already stabilized. Luke stepped out, soaked and weary. Eve ran to help unload. Their hands brushed as they lifted a stretcher. Neither said anything, but both felt a small spark of understanding. Inside the trauma bay, they moved with perfect sync again. Eve's voice guided. Luke's hands obeyed. When the work was done, Luke leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "You were right," he said quietly. "Sometimes the hardest part is remembering why we chose this life." She looked at him with tired eyes. "Maybe that's why we're both here, to remind each other." The rain slowed outside. The night grew quieter as the ER settled into a rare moment of calm. Luke walked to the vending machine and offered her a can of coffee. She took it and smiled softly. They drank in silence. The bitter warmth of the drink mixed with the faint smell of rain. Somewhere down the hall, Sophie's photo still rested in Luke's pocket. And Eve couldn't stop thinking about the gentle way he spoke her name. In that still moment, surrounded by the hum of machines and the heartbeat of the hospital, something changed between them. Not love yet, not even closeness, but a silent respect that started to heal both of them from the inside. They returned to work as pages were called and doors opened again. But now every time Eve passed the ambulance bay, she found herself looking for Luke's calm face. And every time Luke saw her walking through the bright hall, his day felt a little less heavy. The following week started with a calm that felt strange after so many nights of noise. The weather grew warm again, and sunlight filled the hospital windows. Eve came to work early, holding a cup of coffee and a notebook full of patient notes. She greeted the nurses with a nod and went straight to the trauma bay to check the equipment. Everything looked ready, clean, and waiting. Luke was already outside near the ambulance, wiping the rain stains from the windows left from the night before. His partner joked about him caring too much about a vehicle. Luke only smiled and said that neatness saved time. Worked quietly as always, as by afternoon, traffic accidents started to fill the ER again. The heavy tension of real emergencies returned, louder than before. Eve and her team worked fast as stretchers rolled in one after another. Luke made 2 emergency runs back to back. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his eyes showed tiredness that went deeper than sleep could fix. When the clock touched 6, the air changed. A loud crash came from outside the hospital gates, followed by the wailing siren of another ambulance arriving, with lights flashing. Luke jumped out carrying a small patient, blood on his gloves. Nurses rushed to help, and Eve ran forward. "We have multiple injuries incoming," Luke shouted to the staff. "This one's bad. Female, maybe 6 years old." Lost consciousness in the ambulance, Eve moved fast, preparing the trauma room. She took one look at the child and froze for one short, terrible second. The little girl had curly brown hair and soft skin pale from shock. Luke followed behind, his voice breaking as he said her name. "Sophie. It's my Sophie." The sound hit Eve like a shot. She forced her breath steady and turned to face him. "Luke, you need to step back. Let us handle this." He shook his head, eyes wide with fear. She was at her school concert. She isn't waking up." Eve placed her hands firmly on his shoulders. "I promise I will do everything I can. But you can't be in the room." He stood silent, trembling, then stepped back against the wall. His hands were shaking as he watched through the glass while nurses lifted Sophie onto the table. Eve's voice turned calm. She checked the monitor and spoke with crisp direction. "We need an oxygen line, chest x-ray, and prepare for internal scan." Her heart raced, but her face stayed steady. The team moved fast around her. Time felt thin, every second too important to lose. Sophie's pulse flickered weakly, her breathing shallow. Eve swallowed hard and worked faster, her mind chasing solutions without pause. Inside, she heard the echo of Luke's voice, and how he had once said Sophie was his reason to live.
All that reason
Lay still under the bright white light. Outside the room, Luke stood motionless, his uniform stained, his eyes locked on the window. Claire, the nurse, walked up behind him. "You should sit down," she said softly. He didn't move. "That's my baby in there. Can't sit down." Eve kept working until the scan showed an internal bleed in Sophie's abdomen. She turned to the team. "Call the surgical suite. We're operating now." It was risky to move the child that quickly, but there was no choice. They rushed her to the elevator, as Luke followed, until security stopped him near the door. He stood frozen, fists tight at his sides. Inside the surgical room, Eve led the small team. Her hands moved steady, though her heart hurt. The soft beeping of machines filled the air. Sweat gathered under her cap, but she didn't notice. Every move she made was careful. Minutes turned to hours as she worked to stop the internal bleeding and repair the damage. She refused to think about failure. When the final suture was tied, Eve looked at the monitor and saw the line on the screen steady again. The rhythm that had faded before now beat with life. She let out a slow breath. "She's stable," she whispered. Outside, in the waiting area, Luke sat with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. Claire touched his shoulder. "She made it," she said softly. He looked up slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. "She's alive?" Claire nodded with a small smile. "Dr. Carter saved her." Luke stood still for a long moment before walking toward the corridor. He saw Eve coming from the operating room, pulling her mask down. Her face looked pale, her hair damp with sweat, but her eyes were calm. "She's going to be okay," Eve said. "The surgery went well. She'll need rest, but she's safe." Luke couldn't speak. He took one step closer, his throat tight. Thank you, he finally said in a broken voice. Thank you for saving my girl. Eve shook her head lightly. You don't need to thank me. She's strong. She wanted to stay with you. Luke's hands covered his face as tears came, quiet but steady. The hallway around them fell silent, except for the steady heartbeat of the machines inside the room. Eve stood near him, watching the man who had been called fearless, now trembling with love and relief. Something inside her heart shifted again. Something deep and wordless that tied her to him in a way she couldn't name. That night, when everything quieted, Eve stood by the hospital window. The city lights looked softer than usual. Behind her, Luke sat beside Sophie's bed, holding her small hand. And in that peaceful silence, the line between titles and uniforms faded, leaving only two people and the fragile strength of a life saved against the odds. Morning light touched the hospital windows as the city woke again. The storm had passed, leaving a soft, golden glow over the streets. Inside the recovery room, Sophie slept with a small bandage near her side, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Luke sat beside her bed, his eyes tired but peaceful. He had not left the room since the night before. Every time Sophie moved, he reached for her hand, just to know she was still there. Eve came in quietly, her white coat rustling as she carried a chart. Luke looked up and stood. He looked different now, softer, lighter, though the long shadows of fear were still behind his eyes. She's healing well, Eve said with a small nod. Her vitals are strong. She might even wake by noon. Luke smiled faintly. You really did save her life. Eve shook her head. She saved her own by fighting through. I only helped her body catch up. Luke looked at his daughter again. His voice turned low. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know. If she had not made it, I don't know what I would have done. Eve stepped closer to check Sophie's foreline. You don't have to thank me, Luke. Just take care of her. That's what matters. For a few moments, they stood quietly, the room filled with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. It was a calm sound, soft and steady, like hope made real. Later that day, Sophie's eyelids fluttered open. Her small voice barely filled the air when she whispered, Daddy. Luke jumped up from the chair and leaned close. I'm here, sweetheart. Her lips curved into a tiny smile. Are we going home soon? Soon, Eve said gently. But you have to rest a bit longer. Then you'll go home with your dad. Sophie looked at Eve curiously. Are you the doctor my daddy talks about? Eve smiled. I suppose I am. Daddy said you're the bravest person he's ever met, Sophie said, before her eyes closed again. Luke laughed under his breath, his face red from emotion. Eve blinked fast and turned away for a second, afraid that if she spoke, her voice might break. Over the next few days, Sophie's color returned, and the nurses joked about her cheerful energy. Eve found herself visiting the recovery room more often than required. She brought picture books and small fruit cups, pretending it was all part of standard duty. Luke noticed but never said anything. One afternoon, while Sophie was asleep, they sat by the small window that overlooked the city. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Luke's voice carried the weight of reflection. When I first met you, I thought you were another proud doctor. The kind who never listens to the people on the ground. Eve smiled, but did not look offended. And I thought you were stubborn. You made me nervous that first day when you corrected me about the patient's vitals. Luke laughed softly. Guess we were both wrong. She turned her head slightly. Maybe we needed to see each other under pressure before we could understand. He nodded. Maybe, or maybe life just likes to show people their mistakes, one lesson at a time. A nurse walked in then, breaking the silence. Dr. Carter, you have a call from the chief office? Eve stood up quickly. I'll return soon. When she returned, her expression looked puzzled. The chief had offered her a position to lead a trauma program in another state. It was the kind of promotion most doctors dream about, but her mind was not as clear as she expected. She looked around the recovery room and saw Luke reading a storybook beside Sophie. The sight warmed something inside her that no title or job could reach. That evening, as twilight fell, Luke found Eve in the hallway, lost in thought. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, she said softly. Then after a pause added, They offered me a position far from here. It's a good offer. He stayed silent for a moment. So, you're leaving? I don't know yet, If you go, they'll be lucky to have you. Eve looked at him, trying to read the quiet behind his words. Thank you, he smiled gently. Just don't forget that this place still needs people like you. Before she could answer, Sophie's laugh echoed from her room. Luke turned toward the sound, his shoulders relaxing. Eve followed with her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. When she walked back into the recovery room, Sophie reached out her small hand. Can I draw something for you? Eve nodded. Of course, Sophie handed her a paper with a crayon sketch of 3 people standing under a big sun. This is you and Daddy and me, she said proudly. Eve swallowed a lump in her throat. It's beautiful. Luke watched in silence, emotion in his eyes. In that room full of machines and light, the picture looked like a promise of life beyond pain. Now the hospital noise faded into the background as Eve stood holding the drawing, her heart fuller than it had been in years. Somewhere deep inside, she began to wonder if perhaps healing came not only through medicine, but through moments like this, where love quietly rebuilt what fear had broken.